A new UN report on climate change says we are largely to blame for global warming. It says there will be more melting ice, warming air and rising seas this century. So what should be done to reverse this? And will the report be taken seriously by those who pollute the most? This is Inside Story. Hello, welcome to the programme. I'm Lauren Taylor. Leading climate experts have raised the likelihood that humans are responsible for global warming. The latest report from the UN Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change says it's now 95% certain that human behaviour is responsible. It's the strongest message yet from the world's top scientists on what may be behind the rising average global temperatures. One of the most controversial subjects in the report was how to deal with a slowdown in warming in the past 15 years. Climate sceptics say that casts doubt on the scientific consensus on climate change. Let's bring in our guests. In Stockholm, Martina Kruger. She is the head of climate and energy for Greenpeace Nordic. In Cambridge, we have Nicolette Bartlett, senior programme manager at the University of Cambridge Programme for Sustainability Leadership and the Prince of Wales's Corporate Leaders Group. And joining us on Skype from New York is Bjorn Lomborg. He's the director of the Copenhagen Consensus Centre and author of The Sceptical Environmentalist. But let's go first to Josefino Comiso, who joins us from Stockholm. Mr. Comiso works at the Earth Sciences Division at NASA and is co-author of the IPCC report. Thanks very much indeed for your time. So the report says that it's now extremely likely that global warming is a man-made phenomenon. How much difference will that assessment make?
Well, in the last report, they already mentioned that global warming is incontrovertible. And so with this new report, the final conclusion is that it's even more serious than that. They have 95% confidence right now as opposed to 90%. So this conclusion was arrived at because a lot of research went through in the last 6 years, and we have now a lot more data. There's a lot more utilization of satellite data, for example, which enables ability of observers to map out the entire globe as a whole and look how the entire globe is changing from one season to another and from 1 year to another.
So who will feel it most, do you think?
Pardon me?
Who will feel the impact of this change in temperatures, this change in the climate most?
I think it would be the tropical regions, because in the tropics, the temperature is already near the threshold of critical temperatures, beyond which you can see some possibly irreversible changes.
What about this, the issue of the famous pause? What people have described, the skeptics have said this, the rise in temperatures hasn't been as big as had been predicted. How does the report deal with that particular issue? Like
the temperature in the last 10 years have been relatively flat, but there are many factors that can affect that. If you look at the average of the temperature in the last 10 years, actually, it's still the warmest 10 years in the history of the measurement of temperature that started with the start of the Industrial Revolution. So it's not as if the temperature has cooled down. In fact, the warmest temperature that is measured by some centers is 2010. So it's not really flat. It just so happened that in 1998, it was relatively high because of a very strong El Nino that caused the temperature of the Earth to be relatively high. So if you accompany that with the temperature that came after that, then it became flatter than what it was during the previous decade. But as I said, what we have right now for the last 10 years is still the warmest decade since 1900.
And I know that the report doesn't necessarily go into what needs to happen, but what do you as a scientist think needs to happen now as a priority to try to change the way the curve is going?
There needs to be a curtailing in the uses of greenhouse gases, and primarily carbon dioxide. And that can be done in many ways. For example, humans right now are using energy in such a very inefficient way. And a large fraction of that energy can be saved by just giving a better education to human beings and let them realize that if they curtail their use of energy by even just 30% each, they can save a lot of fossil fuels from being burned and released to the atmosphere, and then enable the trend in the increase in the atmosphere from going up so fast.
OK. Josefino, Comiso, thank you very much indeed. I know that you've got other meetings to dash to, so we'll let you get to those, but I'll bring back in our other three guests who've been waiting patiently. Thank you very much, all of you. If I could start with this certainty, the greatest certainty that this report claims for global warming being caused by man. Martina Kruger, will this make any difference, in your view, to the kind of actions that are actually taken as a result of this?
Well, I would hope so, because the report is really very, very clear in it is man that has dominantly sort of caused the changes that we're seeing already, and it will only get worse if we don't change the trends. And now you don't really have any politician who can hide behind any excuse saying, I didn't really know better, or there was confusion about what caused it and what needs to be done. And one of the, I think, most interesting parts in this new report is also that the report, in quite some clarity, shows what kind of budget we still have to burn, what fossil fuels, which amount of fossil fuels we can still burn before we are reaching this threshold of real dangerous climate changes. And we can actually calculate how much time we have and how fast we need to do the energy revolution away from fossil fuels, with the help of energy efficiency, as was said, to renewable energy.
Okay,
those technologies all exist,
okay,
and they are ready to take over. So
let me just bring in Bjorn Lomborg just on the broader point. I mean, we knew in the past, or they've said in the past, they thought it was man-made, and now it's more certain it's man-made. What do you view that difference? Does that make a big difference?
I don't really think so, no. It is very clear that man is causing part of global warming. I think pretty much everyone has already known that. The much bigger issue is, how do we tackle it? And unfortunately, for the last 20 years, we've been trying to do so essentially by buying very expensive carbon cuts. And of course, not surprisingly, that means that rich countries have done a little to feel good, but really not all that much. And we certainly haven't gotten either China or India, the other big emitters, on board. What we need to do is to realize it's not about saying the technologies are there. Sure, in principle, we could do this if money was no restriction. But in a cash-strapped world, we really have to find much, much cheaper green energy. So this is about getting innovation going and get much cheaper green energy before we try to say, let's cut a lot.
OK. Nicolette Bartlett, can I bring you in on the sort of the business perspective of this? I mean, is the business world ready to make the kind of cuts that this report suggests are needed?
Thank you, Erlen. I think that they are. I mean, and our companies are really clear that this report represents a very broad consensus from science. Obviously, science is never 100% certain of anything, really, but they recognise the authority of the IPCC and have, not just from this report with its 95% certainty, but from previous reports, they do take the science incredibly seriously, and they believe that we should act and act now, because it seems a sensible insurance policy to follow the advice of hundreds and thousands of scientists who've been working on this for such a long time. And I think this carbon budget issue is really critical, because while I agree this is an innovation opportunity, we need to be investing in that innovation and finding ways to make this as cost effective as possible. To change infrastructure takes time, and to get it at scale takes time. That's not just about research budgets, but it's also about engineers and companies being able to implement this and learning from their mistakes. To do that means we need to start acting now, because that budget is a hard limit, and it's an absolute hard limit. So the more we do now, the less we can do later. Whereas if we have to wait and delay that, we will have to increase our actions later, which will potentially be even more expensive. So it seems a good insurance policy from a business perspective to start acting now. It's just good risk management from their perspective.
If I could bring you back in, Bjorn Lomborg, I mean, in 2009, there was already the position where people seemed to recognise that there was a problem, and there wasn't enough impetus apparently at Copenhagen for all the leaders to come together and agree on something. We've had Ban Ki-moon saying that in 2015 really people have to act, and they have to act now. Is the impetus any bigger now than it was then?
Quite frankly, no. Everyone wants to do something, but they're not willing to pay very much. And I perfectly understand the argument of saying, if we're going to keep the limit of 2 degrees, yes, then we have to act now. But we're not going to do so as long as it's very costly. And that's the simple fact. Companies are moving to the US because fracking has made energy much cheaper. We've moved a lot of our production to China and elsewhere because there's not the same kind of environmental regulations and strict CO2 limits. We are just not going to be able to cut carbon emissions very much unless we find much cheaper ways. So we can sit here and wish all we want, but unless we actually get innovation going and get much cheaper green energy, we're not going to solve this problem.
Martina Kruger, would you agree with that? Is there enough impetus behind the kind of reducing the cost of renewables?
We have seen, of course, the costs of renewable energy coming down a lot, so we are really at the start of an energy revolution. What really needs to happen is that fossil fuel interest needs to get out of the way for the energy revolution. That is happening. In China, for the first time last year, we had more new production of renewable energy than all other energy sources together. So this is happening, but we do need to make sure that we're really implementing this now and not wait for something that may happen in the future, because we need to act on science and not on science fiction. And we have already lost a lot of years by waiting for some technology that might be around the corner when we actually have the right technologies that can help us out of this mess now, and we just need to implement it.
Bjorn Lomborg, you were gesticulating there. Do you want to come back in on that?
Yes, well, basically, I love the quote, we have to act in science now instead of science fiction. But reality is, we have been acting on the panic for the last 20 years, and I'm pretty sure the previous spokespeople like Martina have been saying, we gotta cut now, we gotta go to green energy. We haven't. And quite frankly, the International Energy Agency still estimates we will have almost the same fraction in 2035 that we have now of fossil fuels. The simple reality is we can wish all we want, but unless we get green energy to be much cheaper, I agree with Martina that we have seen it drop dramatically, but it's still nowhere near cheap enough. And so it really is a question of waking up to reality. We can continue down the same road that has failed for the last 20 years, or we can focus a lot more on innovation and getting green energy to be cheap enough that everyone will want to buy it.
If I can just bring Nicolette Bartlett back in there briefly there. You're sort of the kind of the business world is who you're representing. Is there an extreme sort of vested interest in the kind of fossil fuel industry there's been a break to trying to create these new industries or help the new industries?
Well, I can't say I can speak on behalf of that for my companies. I mean, I can speak on behalf of my companies, and for them, yes. I mean, this is not really what they focus on. This is what they really focus on is, on one level, we need to innovate, we need to find ways in which this green energy needs to come down. And they are ready to do that and invest in that if and when they have a level playing field. But I think you can only have a level playing field when you start to price into the economy the impact that, for example, these burning these fossil fuels are having, as well as deforestation, etc. So things like carbon pricing is something they very much will support as a pricing mechanism, as an economic measure for us to be able to make that green energy cheaper. And it's something that they're already beginning to invest in. But the more we create that level playing field in other places, we have a carbon price here in Europe, although it's very low at the moment. We have carbon pricing systems coming online in many other countries, including systems being tested in China. If we can get those up and running in a place where we are starting to see the incentive to invest more and more and more into these low carbon technologies, then I think we'll start to get scale. I think that's what we should be focusing on, the solutions, rather than worrying about where the conspiracy theories lie or who is stopping this.
OK. We'll pause for a moment. And behind the headlines of extreme weather and worries about climate change, some communities are benefiting from the new summer thaw. Fishermen in northern Canada say they're enjoying bigger catches than ever before because of climate change. Daniel Lack has been meeting the men making a bounty in Canada's eastern Arctic.
Beneath the still, ice-free and warming waters of Cumberland Sound, more fish than ever before.
So we'll start loading some turbot from here.
A great first catch for Peter Killebuck on his new trawler's maiden voyage. Greenland halibut, known as turbot, are a species local Inuit just began to catch in recent years. Now a longer ice-free season is helping build a commercial fishery where once people fished only for food.
We went out to test our lines and also to test new fishing grounds in Cumberland Sound. And I'm glad to say that with the effort of everybody, we did catch quite a bit of turbot in a very small amount of time.
New machines at Pangnirtung's fish processing plant prepare turbot for export to East Asia. Bigger fishing boats catching more fish mean dozens of jobs in a place where most are unemployed or work for the government.
It kind of falls really well into a traditional lifestyle. And so if people are able to use some skills that they've always had and apply them to a job, then that's something that will probably be of more long-term benefit.
Projects like this newly built small craft harbor and this entire fishing pier show that the authorities here are taking the prospect of commercial fishing seriously. But there are those who warn that looking for opportunity in what is essentially a global climate crisis might be premature. Elsewhere in Canada's western Arctic and off Alaska, commercial fishing has been halted until scientists do more research on one of the least understood ecosystems on the planet, the polar seas.
I think that's a precautionary approach that's actually enshrined in international law, is when you don't understand a place, you study it before you start exploiting it. And that's what we should do.
But Canada has been cutting funding for Arctic research, and many of those who live in this harsh environment want to seize whatever opportunities arise from climate change, even as they confront its challenges. Daniel Lack, Al Jazeera, Pangnirtung.
But the picture is more complicated. What's good for one community in the Arctic will ultimately spell very bad news for the rest of us. Tarek Basley spoke to David Vaughan from the British Antarctic Survey.
The Arctic sea ice is only one of the signals that we're seeing in the Arctic that are all coherent. They're all showing us that there's a highly elevated area of warming in that across the Arctic. It's reduced snow cover, sea ice is reduced, the glaciers are diminishing, and of course the Greenland ice sheet is now losing ice into the oceans, which is causing some part of the sea level rise that we see.
So let's resume our discussion. Bjorn Lomborg, if I could bring you in, one of the things that you've talked about is extreme weather and how that's often linked to the issue of climate change. Do you think that this report actually deals with that at all?
Well, yes, it does. And it tells us very clearly there are some things we know. The IPC actually did a special report just on extreme weather. There are some things that are going to get more extreme. For instance, we're going to see more heat and hence more heat waves. We're also going to see more heavy downpour, which could also lead to flooding. But again, as your show in some way shows, we need to remember it's not just such that global warming is bad for good things and good for bad things. That's sort of a caricature version of global warming, because just like we're going to see more heat waves, which is bad, we're also going to see fewer cold waves, which is good. Just like we're going to see more precipitation, which leads to more flooding, which is bad, we also will mean that we will see fewer people with water scarcity. We're actually estimating about 1.2 billion fewer with water scarcity by the end of the century because of global warming. Now, overall, global warming has more negatives than positives. That's why it's a problem. But we should stop having this conversation in a very unnuanced way where we just say global warming is bad for everything and it's terrible for all the good things that we want to encourage. It has both positive and negative impacts.
Martina Kruger, just on that point of the sort of nuancing, is part of dealing with this climate change something to do with actually getting the messages across in a particular way so that people don't just switch off because they feel like they've either heard it before or they've already made up their minds what they think?
One of the very encouraging messages from this report really was that there is still a window of opportunity for us to avoid the real dangerous climate change, where we really have the runaway climate effect. It's not a long, big window, but we can still do it. And we will be seeing a very nuanced discussion about all the impacts in March when the climate panel is releasing its next report that is specifically on that. But of course, at one point, we will have a situation where the negatives of climate change will be so much bigger than any positive impact that you might imagine.
Just on that point of what we can and can't do, what would you say? Is this now up to governments to make the action, or would you direct it to ordinary people and say, look, it's your responsibility and these are the things that you could do to make a difference?
Listen, it's really very, very much up to the governments to set the framework so that what we're calling the energy revolution, the change to renewable energy can actually happen. The first step would be to take away all the subsidies for what fossil fuels are still getting. Fossil fuels are globally still being subsidized about at least 5 times more than all the renewable energy together. That's what I've referred to before at saying, let the fossil fuels get out of the way of the energy revolution. So that is really setting the framework for this is really something that the politicians need to do.
Nicolette Bartlett, is that fair? Do you think the politicians need to be the ones who lead this, or can businesses, for instance, take the initiative and set their own benchmarks?
So I think it's a bit of both, Lauren. I think there is so much that business can do, and they are already beginning to do on their own, of course, and that's through their consumers, through their supply chains, and actually through the way that they generate their own electricity for their factories, etc., and manufacturing processes, etc. And really focusing on the energy efficiency and the resource efficiency is, of course, very good for their businesses in the first place. Also, they need to adapt and begin to prepare themselves to be resilient, because even if we do manage to decrease our emissions and kind of make our 2-degree target, we will still be facing quite a bit of impact, particularly for those who have infrastructure on the coast, etc. And so therefore ensuring that they are focusing on adaptation will be critical.
Okay.
However, they can only do so much without, and that's really important, they can only do so much without government.
Okay.
There has to be a policy framework.
Okay. Bjorn Lomborg, if I can just bring you in with a final word on a report like this every 5 to 6 years, a massive report, loads of paper. How useful is this format, briefly?
Well, I mean, it's great to get to know what's the problem, but what we really need to start focusing on, and that was also what we were talking about last, is the policies. And unfortunately, the IPCC doesn't tell us that. We need to know, where do we get the biggest bang for our climate buck? And we haven't had that conversation yet.
Martina Kruger, if you had one suggestion to make, what would it be?
Well, it would be sort of to take away all the subsidies that fossil fuels are enjoying at the moment. That would be a very, very good first step.
Okay, and if I can ask you also, Nicolette Bartlett, what's your one answer solution to climate change?
Gosh, that's a really difficult one. I would say that one of the key things that I've mentioned before would be to price carbon into the economy. That is absolutely critical.
Okay, well, thank you very much indeed. Thanks to all my guests, Martina Kruger, Nicolette Bartlett and Bjorn Lomborg. Thanks very much indeed for your time.
Thank you.
And thank you very much for joining us on this edition of Inside Story. Don't forget, you can always send us your feedback. Just email your thoughts to us at insidestory@aljazeera.net. Thanks very much indeed for watching. Bye for now.